consonants in American English, and it's organized in terms of articulatory features. So you can see across the top, place of articulation. Each one of those categories, bilabial, labiodental, interdental, alveolar, palatal, velar, and glottal, are all places in the vocal tract that we constrict air in order to produce sound. So those are all places of articulation. Manner of articulation, the way we make sounds, and we're going to talk about several different kinds of manners of articulation, including stops, fricatives, affricates, nasals, liquids, and glides. Again, you don't have to know the definitions of all these for this quiz, but you will need to know it for the second quiz. So this is just kind of a preview. So these, if you look up here, you'll see that there are some characters that you recognize and some characters that you don't. Each one of the characters on this grid represents a unique phone, a unique speech sound that we use in American English. And the way this transcription system works, you guys, we're going to learn this transcription system starting next week. The way this system works, every sound has its own symbol. So anytime you write a particular symbol, it always sounds the same. And that's really important in English because, as you know, English spelling is evil, right? English spelling is evil. For example, you guys all know what that spells, right? What does that say? No, it says fish. It says fish. This is the f in enough. This is the in women. And this is the sh in motion. Fish. Thank you very much. Okay, English spelling, bad. English spelling is almost completely arbitrary, right? Because it reflects, the way we write down what we say, reflects not necessarily how we say it now, but how words have been said in the past. And look, the pronunciation of words changes over time. Anybody ever try to read Beowulf in English in high school? Look at, or even try to read Shakespeare, right? The way we say things changes over time, and yet writing things down has preserved old spellings. So we've got all these weird spellings that don't actually match with how we say words. So instead, when we talk about phonetics and phonology and morphology in this class, we're going to focus on using a system where every sound has only one symbol. So anytime you see that symbol, you know exactly what sound we're talking about. We're going to turn English into a one sound, one symbol correspondence, kind of like Spanish. So that when you see something, you will know exactly how to say it. Or if you write something down that you heard, I will know exactly what you heard by looking at the way you wrote it down. And this system is organized in terms of these articulatory features. Place of articulation, manner of articulation, and then the third main one that we'll talk about with regard to consonants is voicing. And that's whether or not your vocal folds are vibrating when you make the sound. And that's the difference, for example, between the sound p, 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 the P sound, and b, 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 the B sound. Okay? The only difference between those two sounds is whether or not I turn my vocal folds on before I let the air out of my mouth. That's the only difference. And we're going to learn about that, and I'm going to teach you how to feel what's going on in your mouth, information you have learned to ignore over your lifetime. I'm going to teach you how to redirect your attention to what's happening so that you'll be able to figure out what sound you're making when you say a particular sound in terms of these different features. So at the phonetics level, the units we use are articulatory features. We use them to create phones, which are individual speech sounds. And the rules that we're using are the rules that say these are the combinations that are legal for the language that I'm speaking. So we talk about legal things that are legal and things that are illegal for a given language. So if you make a sound, for example, in American English, this is not a legal consonant combination. Okay? It's not a legal consonant combination. That's not a consonant that shows up in any American English words. But if you speak Mosa, it's a totally legal consonant, right? If you speak a click language, you probably have as a consonant in your language. So there are rules about what sounds you can make and have it still be English, and rules about what sounds you can't make and have it still be English. That's what's happening at the level of phonetics. The next level up is phonology. And phonology is where we use phones as the base unit. Specifically, we use what we call phonemes. Phonemes are the specific subset of phones, because there are lots and lots of phones in the languages of the world, but phonemes are the specific phones that we can use to make words in our language. So we know that a sound is a phoneme in our language because just changing that sound can change what word we're saying. So if I say bit, and then I say pit, those are two different words for us, right? And because I can do that, because I can generate what's called a minimal, what do I spell? Minimal, I need more caffeine, minimal pair. Okay? I can generate a pair of words that differ only in a single speech sound. I can say these sounds are phonemes of my language. So I know that p and b are two separate sounds in English because if I say pit and bit, I get two totally different words. And all of these are phonemes of American English. These are the phoneme consonants of American English. Now, there are variations. When words show up, when sounds show up in particular contexts, they change a little bit. So a given phoneme can have what we call allophones. Now, anybody in here familiar with genetics? You can have a gene, you can have alleles. What's an allele? Do you know? Allele, A-L-L-E. Allele, so when we talk about allophones, this is just going back to the root of the word, we're talking about different manifestations of a given sound. So you might have in genetics a dominant form of a gene and a recessive form of a gene. You've heard of that? Well, when it comes to sounds, you can kind of have dominant forms and recessive forms. The dominant form is the form of the sound that shows up the most often. And then you have like a recessive form that shows up when it's in a particular context. So for example, the sound p, okay, this sound right up here, what we would call a voiceless bilabial stop. What you have called up to this point, the P sound. That actually has some allophones in English. So if it shows up at the beginning of a word, we see the dominant form. That's p. And if you put your hand right in front of your mouth and say pit, go ahead. You're going to have to do this a lot in this class, so just get used to talking to yourself. Pit. What do you feel?
Air.
You feel a burst of air? Okay, now I want you to say spit.
Spit.
What happens?
Still air.
Is there still air? Is it the same? Go back and forth. Pit, spit. Pit, spit. Okay, what's the difference?
One's air.
There's less air, right? There's less air. Why do you think there's less air? The S in the front, the S sound in the front used up some of the air. Because the S sound, the S, right? The voiceless alveolar fricative. You'll get used to that. All right, the S sound used up some of the air pressure that you built up, so you don't have as much air to make the P sound. So those are actually, so P and P are actually two different versions of the P sound. And we would call those allophones. They show up in different environments, but it's totally predictable which one you get. Do you get the one with the extra burst of air, which we would write like that, saying that we've got an extra burst of air when we make it? Or do you get this one, which is just the p sound with no extra burst of air? The dominant form of this phoneme is with the burst of air. The recessive form of this phoneme is with the no burst of air.
Question.
Yes?
Could it also be like in different languages, like in Farsi, for example, there's like 3 different ways of saying G, basically. There's ge, re, re. So would that be an example of it too?
Those are actually, if you're moving further back, those are actually 3 different sounds.
Oh.
Those,
So, okay, so
and
they
it depends on
can't
how
be-
you use them. Okay, it
Okay.
depends. In some cases, they might be occurring in what we call free variation. Doesn't matter which sound you use. And in some cases, it actually matters. Can you make different words with those 3 sounds?
Yeah.
So you can do everything else the same, and if you change that one consonant, it's a different word, then those are all separate phonemes.
Oh. Okay.
Those are not allophones. Those are separate phonemes because they change meaning. Now, allophones in one language, so this contrast, that we would call this aspirated P, meaning. If I say pit or pit, it doesn't change anything, it doesn't change the meaning of the word at all. So those are not separate phonemes for English. But in Hindi, for example, they are separate, and you actually can change meaning with them. So languages around the world are very flexible in what they choose to be a phoneme or an allophone. And the rules that we use at this level, the rules that we apply to phonemes, guide how we can combine them and what happens when we combine them. So for example, there is a rule in English called the aspiration rule. And it says, if you say a voiceless stop, okay, and voiceless stops would be anything, you see over here it says voiceless voice, voiceless voice, voiceless voice, any voiceless stop. So that means puh, tuh, kuh, or that's how you say the last one. It doesn't sound like anything. Any of those voiceless stops, if they occur at the beginning of a word, before a stressed vowel, you will put extra air behind them. Otherwise, you don't do that. So we have rules that say this is how you must pronounce this sound in order to sound like an American English speaker. We do other things, like make vowels longer and shorter at this level. So if I say the word loop, 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 that p at the end, that lovely unaspirated p at the end, loop. Listen to the length of the vowel in the middle. Loop, loop, loop. Now compare that to this. Loom, loom, loom. Now tell me about the vowels in those 2 words. Loop, loom. How are they different? Loop, loom. They're actually the same vowel.
It's almost like one's stressed.
It sounds like it's stressed. One is longer, so it's easier for you to hear.
I mean, they're both long vowels.
Well, we write them both as long vowels, but in fact, when you make them, if we look at the actual amount of time you produce them, the one in loom is actually much longer. And that's because it's coming before a sound that has vocal folds vibrating, whereas loop is not. So I have to shut off my vocal folds so I don't vibrate them before I make the last sound in the word, and it makes the vowel shorter. So we write both of those with double O's, making it seem like the vowels should be the same length. They should both be long ooh sounds. But in fact, they're not. So this is one of the really hard things about being a psycholinguist, is learning not to think in letters, but to think in phonemes. And to really listen to what you're saying and not override it with what you think you're saying because of how you spell it. It's very tricky. Anybody here taking cognitive psychology? Taking cognitive? Did you guys talk about automatic versus controlled processes? Do you remember what that's about? Controlled process is one that you have to think about every step and pay really close attention. An automated process is one where it's just like a habit. You can just say do it and you just do it and you don't have to think about it at all. Well, we have automated our use of spelling, automated how we think about language, when in fact what we're doing is quite different. So I'm going to have to try and help you recontrol how you listen to language. It's really hard, but we can do it, and it's fun. Once you get to do it, it's really neat, but it also starts to drive you a little bit nuts, because everywhere you go, you start to hear things that before you were completely ignoring. You're like, oh my gosh, they just did that. That was vowel lengthening. Did you hear it? And people will be like, what are you talking about? You'll be like, sorry, I'm being a language geek. You know, it happens. There's nothing you can do. Now, if you're a parent, or you have a niece or a nephew, it's really interesting because you start to hear things in the children's speech you never noticed before. You're like, oh, I never realized they were doing that. And it's really cool, but it's kind of nerdy. All right, so we've got things like aspiration, vowel lengthening. Another thing we do, another example of a phonological rule, is something called flapping. This is where we turn sounds, alveolar sounds, specifically alveolar stops. You see it says take an alveolar stop. What's an alveolar stop? Well, if we look over here, we go to alveolar, we look under the stop category, you see there are two alveolar stops, t and d. Okay, t and d, the T sound and the D sound. Those are what we call alveolar stops. And it turns out that we turn them into a completely different sound when we put them in between vowels. So, those two sound totally different, right? I want you to say them.
Not really.
Writer, 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 writer. So they're spelled differently because underneath the middle consonant is different. In the first one, it's right, right, with a t, writer. But no one ever says writer. When I grow up, I want to be a writer. No one ever says that. They would sound really bizarre if they did that. We would never use that strong aspirated form of t. And we don't say rider. I want to be a rider, right? We never do that. It sounds really weird. What we do instead is we turn both of those sounds into what we call a flap. So we don't actually go t, 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 or d, d, d when we make that sound. Instead, we don't really whack the back of our teeth or that ridge behind our teeth with our tongue in a really sharp way. We get lazy and we just go flap, flap. Our tongue just goes flap, flap. So we go rider, rider. Try it. Rider. Just feel your tongue go flap, flap. As opposed to, it's different than if you say right. Say right, like you really mean it. Right. Like it's a command. Right. Ride. Can you feel the difference? Now say rider. Rider. You're just like, oh, too much work, got a whole extra syllable, I can't even make that sound. And here's the thing. People are super lazy when they talk. They want everything to be easier to say. We want everything to be easy. Yeah, you all. Too difficult. Y'all. We're just going to mush those vowels together. Going to. Too much work. Gonna. Have to. Have to. Right? I mean, come on. Words are hard. We don't want things to be hard. We want things to be easy. And so when we speak casually, we have all these ways of modifying words, and everybody knows what you're talking about. Right? I mean, I'm not saying really half the concepts I'm really supposed to be saying right now, but you still understand what I'm saying. Because I'm talking really fast, and I don't really want to have to execute all those consonants because it would be really hard. And the good thing is that you're smart and I'm smart, so you can fill in all the gaps. It's pretty handy. But we have these rules that say, if I put this T sound and this D sound in between those two vowels, I don't actually want to make all the effort to say it, so I'm just going to writer, writer. And they sound exactly the same, and then we have to use context. But if you ask people, do you say those exactly the same way? They will insist that they do not, that they say them totally differently, because they know in their head one has a T in the middle and one has a D in the middle. But if you actually listen to how they say it, exactly the same. So we also have vowels. These are the different vowels of American English. We're going to learn about these different vowels too. And you'll see there are a number of vowels here you might not recognize. And vowels in English are really, really evil when it comes to spelling. So we have to practice quite a bit, and that's why we have a whole separate quiz. All of quiz 2 is just about making sure you understand these symbols and what each one sounds for. That's all it's for, is learning how to write and learning how to read using this system. So I'm going to teach you how to read and write in a totally new writing system for quiz 2. It's super fun. But you need it for everything. So, all right. For all of our projects, you need to be able to write in that system. So we're going to do that next. So when we talk about morphology, we're talking about how do I take phonemes and combine them into units of meaning. And a unit of meaning in a language is called a morpheme. So morphemes, it's any combination of sounds, can be a single sound or combination of sounds, that has its own meaning. And we have 2 different kinds of morphemes we can talk about in general categories. We have free morphemes. Those are morphemes that can occur all by themselves, like the word cat. If I say cat, you all know what I mean. Cat, right? If I say, everybody, I'm going to say a word, I want you to draw the image that comes to your mind when I say it, and I say cat. Pretty much everybody in the room would draw the same kind of picture. Because cat is a free morpheme. Then there are what we call bound morphemes. Bound morphemes are those units of meaning that have to be attached to something else in order to have their meaning come out, so we can tell. So if I said, walk into you and I said, s, s, you'd be like, why are you hissing at me? Are you trying to speak parcel tongue? Like, what's your problem? You're weird. S doesn't mean anything by itself. But if I attach that to the morpheme I just used, cats, all of a sudden, what does this mean? More than one, right? So we have free morphemes which can stand by themselves. And we use these for things like nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs, stuff like that, conjunctions, those things that we think of as words. And then bound morphemes are those things we think of as inflections, suffixes, prefixes, things that we use to mark grammatical features, like this is plural, this is possessive, this is singular, and also things that we use to modify words, change their category. So I, for example, can say strong, he is strong, that's an adjective. Then I can change it by saying strongly, right? I need you to say it strongly, right? And all of a sudden it becomes an adverb, right? So these morphemes can be used to change the category of words. Oh, these bound morphemes. Now, we actually have rules for how we generate the forms of different morphemes, particularly how we generate forms of bound morphemes. And we're very rarely aware, this is some of that implicit knowledge, that we actually know the rules for these things. We think that we know the rule, but actually we typically don't. So if I asked you, how do you make something plural in English, what would you tell me? Add S, right? Add S. That will make something plural. Always?
No.
Because sometimes you have to do things like add ES or, huh?
Sometimes apostrophe.
That's possessive.
It's possessive.
Yeah, it's a little bit different, but still. Sometimes, and some things don't even have a plural, like sheep, fish, money, right?
You ask some people,
Well, it depends on the context, right? Monies, right? That people, and there's, if you say fishes, that means something else, right? But anyhow, so we talk about, so we have a morpheme in English that makes something plural, and very often we spell that morpheme with the letter S. Okay, we write an S on the end. But in fact, the morpheme has 3 different allomorphs. Okay, so there are 3 different ways it shows up, when it shows up, and each one of those is entirely predictable by the place where it shows up, the environment where it shows up in terms of sound. So, for example, if I showed you this, and I said, this is a wug. It's a wug. I have one wug. I get another wug. Now I have two
Wugs.
wugs, right? So listen to that sound at the end. Wugs. Is that an S? It's a Z sound, okay? And it turns out that if we go back and take a look, g, 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 right there. We go back and we look at the last sound on wug, g. It's actually a voiced sound. So the plural that we use will also be a voiced sound. Z, z. So we're going to do that. Now what if I said, okay, this is a gutch. I have one gutch. I go get another gutch. Now I have two gutches. Now it's not z anymore, it's uz. Still not s. What's with that plural s thing you guys were talking about? We still haven't even done a single s yet. Okay? So if I have a sound at the end of the word that's like ch, j, j, any of those sounds at the end, then it will be uz, like bridges, judges, witches. It will be is. But if I make a sound, make a word that has a voiceless sound at the end, like p, right? We've already established that the p sound is a voiceless sound. Lip, lips, cats, picks. Anytime I have a voiceless sound at the end, then I'll get the s. And yet here we are, stubbornly writing in English, spelling things and putting s at the end, and sometimes it's s, and sometimes it's z, and sometimes it's uz. And what's really interesting is that all of you, even though you had never heard the word gutch before or the word wug before, or if I said I have one blick, and then I went and got another blick, and I brought them together, and now I have two blicks. You'll absolutely agree on what the plural of those things should be, even though you've never heard those words before, and that's because you know this morphological rule for English, even though nobody ever taught you. In fact, what they taught you was to make a plural add s, which is in fact a lie. It is completely and utterly wrong. We don't add s. We add uz or z or s to make something plural. And sometimes we don't add anything. Moose. Or sometimes we change the vowel. Mouse, mice. And we're not even consistent about it. It's not house, heis. Right? Yes?
Is that why when little kids start to learn to write, they actually spell it the way it sounds? They put Z's where Z's belong?
That's exactly right. And that's why you start to see, you'll see people, sometimes people will use z as a plural, right? They'll be like, I got curves. And they put z on the end, right? Because they're hearing the z, right? And they're like, that's sassy. Right? Hmm?
So they're going to own it.
They're going to own it, right? I'm going to own those curves. Zzz, right? I'm going to ride them all the way to the bank. Let's go. Okay. So you got the, that zzz sound. They're acknowledging that they're quite aware that that's not a s there on the end. So yeah, that's why kids spell things differently, because when you tell them to, in the beginning, they're trying to figure out this mapping between how we spell something and what it actually sounds like. And so they'll spell things, and there are some people who are unable to move away from that, people with certain kinds of dyslexia. I have a niece who has this really, really badly. And so all they can do is this one, anytime I hear this sound, I have to use this letter, and that's why their spelling is totally off the wall, because they are totally guessing, just mapping.
That's why, like, words like rider and rider, it'll switch the D.
Yeah, they can't hear the difference, right. And it's also why, when people speak another language, if they can't hear the sounds, then they'll use the sound they think they hear. Which is why somebody who speaks a language that doesn't distinguish between the L sound and the R sound, like my friends who speak Japanese as their first language, who speak English, they cannot hear the difference between liver and river. Those two words sound exactly the same to them. Okay? Just like the green and the blue look the same to the Himba. They sound exactly the same. And you're thinking, how can you not hear the difference between river and liver? That's so obvious. And I'll say, well, here you go. Let me give you a comparison in Japanese that my Japanese friends don't have any trouble with. Ready? Rekishi, 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 rekishi. You heard the difference, right? One means history, and the other means death by drowning. It's really important to know the difference. You don't want to go to Japan and say you're majoring in death by drowning. They're going to lock you up as a serial killer. So that's a bad thing. Rekishi? No, actually one has a flap and one has a stop. Rekishi, 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 rekishi. And the tongue is only moving a tiny bit. I know, you don't hear the difference, do you? Liver, river. Those sound so different to you. And to a Japanese person, rekishi and rekishi sound totally different too.
So crazy.
Isn't that cool? But this is why people have accents when they speak in a language, because they're using the phoneme system of the language that they speak, and they don't hear the distinctions that the native speakers hear. Since they don't hear them, they might not make them. And they might guess. Which is why I went to a Japanese restaurant one time, and they gave me an English menu, because of course I'm white, so I can't possibly speak Japanese. And they gave me the English menu, and on the menu I could order flesh orange juice. And I was like, yeah, instead of fresh orange juice, right? Flesh orange juice. I'm like, what, did you like cut your finger and it's gonna be like extra pulpy with extra flesh? You know, gross. Okay, super gross. Now we do this for lots of things. There's lots of rules that we know. Things like making the past tense. And again, for the test, you don't have to know specifically what the rules are. You're going to learn these over time. But you do want to know that at the morphological level, the kinds of rules we're using are rules that tell us what form of the past tense is the right kind to use, given the word we're making. What form of the plural is the right form to use, given the word we're making. So we have different past tenses too, right? I kicked. I loved, right? And we have, and then you can say like, to put a boot on a car, the car was booted, right? So we have different past tense forms, and we know from the kind of word we're using, even though what people would say is, to make it past tense, put ed on it. Sometimes we're putting an ed sound on it, like booted, but more often we're saying just t or d, like kicked and loved. So we're actually not putting ed on it at all, much more often than we think we are. So the next level of linguistic representation is syntax. And this is where we take the words that we make and we combine them to make phrases and sentences. Now, what do I want you to know about this level? I want you to know that this is the level where we create things like noun phrases and verb phrases and sentences. Okay? I don't expect you to know these rules. Like, this is a syntactic rule for making a noun phrase in English. It says you take a determiner, and then you can put an adjective in if you want to, and then you put a noun, so I can say the happy puppy. Or I can just say the puppy, and that's fine. So we have rules for how you can legally combine words together to make phrases and sentences in our language. And that's what I want you to know about syntax. Okay? That this is where we have, the units we're working with are words and phrases, and the rules we're using are the things that let us combine words to make phrases and combine phrases to make sentences. Okay, that's what I want you to know about this unit. So we can do things like we can say a sentence is made up of a noun phrase and a verb phrase. And a noun phrase is made up of a determiner, an adjective, and a noun. And a verb phrase is made up of a verb and a noun phrase. And we know all these parts, and the challenge of learning the syntax of a language is learning the order in which these words and phrases must be put together in order to say something correctly. This is really a challenge for me in Japanese because Japanese doesn't have prepositions like put the book on the table. In Japanese, you would say the book, the table on put. Because the word order is totally different. The syntax is totally different. It's a subject-object-verb language. Verbs always go at the end, and they don't have prepositions. They have postpositions. So whether something's going in something, or on something, or over something, or behind something, goes after the thing. It goes in, on, or over, as opposed to before. It's really challenging to learn those word orders. You're looking at me like, there's languages like that? Yes, there are totally languages like that. And yeah, and in Japanese, you would totally say the book, the table, on put. Actually, you would just say book, table, on put because they don't have determiners like the and they don't have those. So you would just say book, table, on put. And that's how you would say it in Japanese. So we have rules also in syntax for making connections between sentences that mean the same thing but have different structure. So for example, I can say, the hungry girl eats the delicious cookie, right? You guys understand that sentence? The hungry girl eats the delicious cookie. We have rules that let us switch the order to turn it into a passive sentence. So there's an active version of the sentence, the hungry girl eats the delicious cookie. And then I have rules that tell me how I need to switch things around to make it a passive sentence and focus the attention of the sentence on the cookie, not the girl. So the delicious cookie was eaten by the girl. Now, in APA style, don't do this conversion. Don't use this rule. Right? In APA style, it says don't use passive voice. It says focus on using the base sentence structure and don't try to make it fancy by adding in all that junk. Basically, don't use that rule. People love to use it, but in APA style, it says don't. So, but in syntax, one thing we do is use rules to convert sentences into different shapes. To move things around so that we can use them for different situations. So for example, if I said, the hungry girl eats the delicious cookie, and you say, she eats what? You have to know a rule that tells you where you put the substitute word what to map over the delicious cookie, because you didn't hear that part, for example. Those are all syntactic rules. So how we do substitutions and how we move things around in sentences to make different forms of different sentences, like the statement form and the question form and the command form and all those other different forms of sentences. That's all stuff we learn at the syntactic level. The next level, which we'll talk about some because it's important for understanding words, is the level of semantics. Semantics is where we think about what words mean and how words are related to each other in terms of what they mean. So we make connections between words. So for example, you actually have maps in your head. We call these semantic networks. Maps in your head of concepts that are connected. And one thing psycholinguists and cognitive psychologists are interested in is what things you have connected to other things. So depending on the culture you grew up in, if I say peanut butter, you actually think of different things, right? So if I say peanut butter, what do you think most Americans think of? Jelly. Pretty easy, right? You've got a connection between those two things. If I say dog, you think cat. Okay. And if I say cat, you think mouse. Isn't that nice? See how that works? So nobody ever specifically went and built that network for you, but because of your cultural experience, you have learned that certain concepts tend to co-occur. So the semantic connections of things that we know develop into these kind of webs of knowledge. And psycholinguists are interested in going in and figuring out what webs of knowledge are common for people in particular situations, particular cultures, or which surpass cultures and seem to be common for people in general. So we seem to have some base webs built in. For example, ones that tell us that there are things that are alive in the world and things that were never alive. And across different languages of the world, everybody seems to have this distinction and seems to group things according to things that were alive and things that have never been alive. And there might be distinctions between things that fly and things that swim and things that run. Things that are of different colors. Things that are from humans and things that are not from humans. So there are connections, things that seem to be part of how we have evolved to organize the world that serve as the basis for these networks. And then we build on these networks using our cultural experience. And so you can see here, this is an example of a network of maybe what you know about a particular person. So we have something like Fred is a person is an animal, Fred has a pet, that's Tibbs is a cat, so if he has a cat, then he's a cat liker because he has a cat, you know, so you can kind of have these connections of things that you know. And this is why sometimes thinking of one thing all of a sudden makes you think of something else and you're like, why did I just think of that? And it's because you've got connections somehow between those things, and once the energy, the energy, synaptic energy started flowing in your brain, it started spreading along these connections in your semantic network and somehow brought you over here to this weird corner of your brain that made a connection you had never made before. It's also why sometimes you get those weird gut feelings that something weird is going on, because something has triggered in a network that says danger, be careful, be cautious. You just don't know what it is yet. And then later it goes bing, 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 bing. You're like, oh, that was it. That was the thing that I noticed. Something was strange about the way he wore his scarf. I knew why was he wearing a scarf? It was 80 degrees outside, you know. Tells you something weird. It's that spreading of activation through your semantic network that's triggering things in your awareness. And we know some different rules for understanding the meaning of things and connecting things together. Again, I'm not going to focus too much on this. We'll talk more about the semantics as children learn them, like how do children learn to make connections between different things, and we'll talk about it more in depth at that point. But what I want you to know about semantics for the purposes of the upcoming quiz is that semantics is about meanings of things and the connections between those meanings. And that the meanings we have in our minds come in two broad categories. There are denotative meanings. Those are the meanings that we all share. So when I say cat, there's a denotative meaning to cat that is of a feline, probably a house cat, pointy ears, likes to play with yarn, chase mice, be lazy, run the world, right? You have the kind of general cat, that's the denotative meaning that we all share. And then there are connotative meanings. These are the meanings that we have that are personal. So if, for example, you hate cats, you're violently allergic to cats, you've been attacked by a cat, then when you think of cats, you probably also have a variety of other negative things that come up. Or if you love cats and you raise cats and you show cats and you just think cat's the most fabulous thing and you have a Facebook page dedicated to cats and you wear cat clothes and you know you're a cat for Halloween every year, then you're going to have all these other associations, these connotative associations for cats. So we have denotative and connotative associations. You can also have connotative associations that use words in different ways. So for example, if you call somebody a cool cat, that means something else, right? So that's a different meaning for cat that's not necessarily denotative, because most people might not know that meaning. But in a particular community or group, that has a particular meaning. So that would also count as a connotative meaning. So I want you to know that semantics is about meanings, about the different kinds of meanings we have and how those meanings are connected, and how we interpret the things we hear, how we understand what words mean in a given context. That's what semantics is about. So it's how we know that when I say things like, I'm feeling under the weather today. You know it has absolutely nothing to do with weather. Because under the weather means I don't, what? I don't feel good, right? Although why I would say I'm under the weather makes absolutely no sense. How do you get under weather? Like if you think about the actual units of that saying, it makes 0 sense. But somehow when we put them all together, we go, oh, you feel under the weather, you're not feeling good. Like, where did that come from? And you're like, I never thought about that before. Now you're gonna start listening to the things people say and go, why did we say it that way? That's really bizarre. Like, and the rules that we use for that to do things like create figurative language. These is ways that we use semantics to include and exclude people from our communities. Now again, you don't have this on your handout, I'm not requiring you to know these different examples, but I want you to know that some people who are interested in studying semantics are interested in how it is that we know when I say something like, Jim's head is full of rocks. I don't actually mean his head is full of rocks. How do I know that? And this is where people who are not native speakers get tripped up because they don't know the tricks for interpreting what things mean. They don't have the right connections between different words and different combinations of words to know the right way to think about that. So if I say, oh my gosh, he's a total snake, you know I'm not saying the person's an actual snake. But how do you know that? That's something that you had to learn as part of our culture and learn about how to interpret language. Now it looks like we're going to have 1 minute and it's Friday and the weather is terrible. So I could jump in and tell you about pragmatic rules, but I think what I would much rather do is let you go home